Hey, good to see you. Thanks for coming. This is another episode of Wireframe, brought to you by Design Systems House. I'm your host, Donnie D'Amato, and today we're going to be borrowing questions. What does that mean? I'll get into it in a little bit. But first, I hope everyone's having a good week. As usual, it is Thursday, so I've had a couple of shows already. Continuing to do shows this week because I am trying to make sure that this show is perfect. And every little show adds a little bit more to the perfection that is this production here. So thank you for bearing with me. I really appreciate it. But I was actually going to talk about something completely different today, and then I looked at my catalog of stuff, and apparently I talked about this 3 weeks ago. So I was going to talk about disabled buttons. And the reason I was going to talk about disabled buttons was two different reasons, actually, because one of the things was about how I'm redoing Delta Zeus, and there's a couple of areas where pressing a button at that particular time wouldn't make any sense. So I had to do a lot of thinking about how I wanted to make this interface work such that to avoid myself from making disabled buttons. But also, I had a conversation with my wife about carousels and how buttons appear in carousels and how if you get to the end of the carousel, it's entirely possible that that button might become disabled, and trying to think through alternatives to that, for instance, like looping through the carousel. But anyway, because I talked about that already, I can't talk about it now, or at least it's a little bit too soon to talk about it again because it's only about 3 weeks before. But instead, I'm going to be talking about something else. But before we do that, I want to go over to the doll and ask about disabled buttons just to go ahead and round out that conversation. So let's see how we feel about this. So how do you feel about disabled buttons in a UI? Do you think that it's a good idea, a bad idea? What's your take? Is there no take? I'm assuming that there's no take unless you're still listening to me. Okay, there's no take. It's worth a shot. Look, it worked earlier before the production. I mean, sometimes what happens is it forgets, right? It's been listening for too long. I've been speaking by myself for a really long time. Let's just get into the real show here for today, folks. So the show for today is that I was thinking about doing an AMA. But the reality is that I don't really have a large following. At least I don't think so. I have some people who know who I am. I'm looking at some of the statistics. Actually, the last statistics that I saw is that I'm getting a couple thousand views on YouTube. And that's just mostly from the shorts. From the actual long durations of these shows that I have put together, the full length, not a lot of views there, and that's okay. Again, this is just the beginning of this kind of format, and I'm still learning and trying to make this thing as good as possible. But in the meantime, again, to practice this content and make it as good as possible, I wanted to do an AMA kind of style thing just to see how that feels. Like I said, don't have a real big following, community, but there's opportunities for that to grow, obviously. Actually, one of the places that you can go to, if you're interested, is to go to discord.ds.house. And that actually goes to the Design Systems House Discord. It is mostly dormant, although I had someone ask a question today, which I responded to. So thank you for that question, kind viewer or kind community member. I wish I could figure out Discord, though. Discord is a whole nother beast that I'm unfamiliar with. But instead of trying to ask my community, because again, very quiet in there, I figured that I'd kind of borrow some questions from another community instead. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm not going to say who this community member is that I'm borrowing questions from because I didn't necessarily ask permission. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick and choose. Speaking of picking and choosing, I would like to hope that none of these are necessarily personal to that person that I'm going to be choosing. So like one of the questions was asking about the way that their prescription eyewear is, right? So that's kind of personal to that person. So I'm going to be trying to find some questions that are more generic or more in the field of what and I'll say this person also works in instead. And we're going to ask these questions, and I'm going to answer them from my point of view. All right? Sounds good? Let's give it a shot. All right. So the first question that I think is pretty cool is actually just favorite game. And as it is right now, my favorite game is Overcooked 2. I absolutely love Overcooked 2. I play that more than I probably really should be playing it. To give you a little bit of a sense of how long I've been playing it for, I've been playing it since the game came out for the Switch, and I have over 3,000 hours logged in that game. I really like that game. The next question is the CSS question. When will we see @property used in the wild? I'm using it in the wild right now. So for one of the projects that I'm working on, @property seems to be the way to go, mostly because when we've defined CSS variables in the past, we've always had to define them underneath a selector, so underneath some context. When you use @property, they are kind of defined at any context. So the difference between, like, for instance, defining them at the root and defining them at @property is that when you define them at @property, they're also available in things that are not root, like web components, for example. So I think that's actually a really good use case for them. Additionally, having them separated as different kinds of variables seems to be helpful. I know there's some typing in there, but I actually don't enjoy typing. I've never enjoyed typing, but @property is being used right now. It might be a little bit more clunky than other, defining variables, but I actually do use it. How old were you when you started coding? I started coding at 16, 17 years old. Yeah, something like that. Which you think is like, well, kind of late in your world of coding, but the reality is that when I was, let's see, it was the late 90s when I was that age. So it's been a while. If you started when you were 8 and I started when I was 17, it was probably the same year. So it's the same duration when it comes down to it. So I think there's lots of young people that are coding, which is really cool, and a lot of different avenues and possibilities for people to learn that isn't the way that I learned, which I learned by very much brute force. So the amount of resources that are out there for learning about coding is really cool. What is the newest project that you are working on? It's Delta Zeus. Technically not new because it's actually the oldest project I've ever worked on, but it's new because I've been working on it more recently to upgrade it. And it's getting close. I got really close to it. Hopefully today, after the show, I'm going to go out to a little space that I work at and try to finish it up. We're going to see how close I get because, again, it's back-end related stuff. There's a cron job in there. Not looking forward to that stuff. Debugging is always annoying. But it's going to be wrapped up soon. Favorite year of CSS features? I'm not paying attention to years of CSS. What I will say is the feature I'm looking forward to is anchor positioning. I'm using that in my playground right now for flyouts and things like that. And I think once that becomes mainstream, that's going to be really cool. WebKit actually, or I should say Apple just posted a blog talking about anchor positioning. So we have signals that it will come to Safari soon. Firefox just needs to get on this already, and we will be in a really good spot. Which CSS framework for production? So, as a traditionalist, I would normally say none, obviously. But in a large company for making components and things like that, and even in my own playground, I'm using CSS modules. I think that's the right play to go. Any other framework is going to have some serious cons to it that I wouldn't recommend. But I think CSS modules is the right play, depending on your infrastructure, of course, because in some cases you might not be able to use CSS modules, but I think that's a really good framework to use. Current favorite browser. This is actually an interesting question because I currently started using a PC again earlier this year, and I never changed to Chrome. So I just started using Edge on that PC, and it's been mostly fine. There have been some instances where the browser effectively visually crashes, where it kind of becomes like an entirely black screen and have to like wait for it to figure itself out again. I don't know if that's the browser or the computer. I like to think it's the browser. And these are usually in cases where there's a lot of elements on the page. Like as an example, when I'm doing the curation of the shorts that come from these episodes, there's a lot of them on the page, and sometimes when I scroll too fast or I'm playing too many of them, it'll just like kind of crash that page for me or like refresh or something like that. So I don't know, again, if that's Edge or something else, but I've been using Edge recently for my personal stuff. There's a question about Tailwind on here. I'm going to answer that with my blog post. The blog post is called Defending Tailwind, which, if you know me, you're like, how are you defending Tailwind? You have to read the blog post to find out. The TLDR that I'll mention is that Tailwind is really good, I think, in terms of standardizing things, the way that React has standardized things. Whether or not that standard is a good standard is the thing that's up for debate, obviously. But in order to get everyone on the same page, I think it did a good job there. Past that, not so much. Let's see, moving on here. How do you feel AI is going to shape the work of developers in the midterm? I can tell you how it's shaping my work right now. The amount of what we would effectively call vibe coding that I'm doing is significant. And I'm going to say vibe coding is the normal term because it's really just, having an AI system or copilot going on. I think the important caveat is that, and maybe I shouldn't even say that I'm vibe coding because I'm not actually vibe coding. My definition of vibe coding is basically having the AI generate code and you pushing that directly to production. Like, that's what I think vibe coding is. When you are using it as a copilot, where you're in control of the plane, so to speak, and it's giving you suggestions and work and stuff like that, and you are addressing that and making sure that it's the right direction in all these cases, that's more aligned to what I'm doing, and I think what most people are doing. The thing that I don't know how to tease out yet is folks that are applying to positions to try to get work, and then, going through all these vibe-coded things where when you actually get on the job, it's not the same. And that's happened forever, right? Like, CSS is a really good example of that. You go through all this leak code stuff, trying to reverse arrays and sorts and things like that. You do all this stuff, and then you finally get on the job, and they ask you, hey, can you make the text bigger over here, right? It's not a one-to-one. And I'm going to assume that's going to continue based on this, right? Instead of it being CSS as part of the job that wasn't asked about, it's going to kind of be AI being part of the job that's not asked about. Unless, and this is going to be, again, kind of a progressive kind of take, is that if these interviews allow for AI to exist in them, which I think they should, then seeing how that person uses AI as a co-pilot as opposed to, vibing, right? And again, I think that's a really important distinction there, right? Because I see all these interviews and people saying, oh, I got to check to make sure they're not AI, they're not using AI, et cetera, and then they use AI in the job, right? It's just like a double standard. So I think it's a lot better for us to embrace the tools that you'll be using in the workplace during the interview as close to the environment that you would possibly be doing. I had a conversation about this with some folks probably over a year ago at this point, where we were trying to figure out what the most appropriate interview scenario would be now that AI is a part of the process, right? Trying to, again, avoid the possibility of completely removing AI, because that's just not going to happen. I think, again, allowing the AI is really important, but I think the thing that we really landed on was that someone watching you still provides a little bit of pressure during the interview. And what probably makes the most sense in an interview scenario is instead to have this like almost like take-home scenario, and I know people don't like take-homes either, but almost like a take-home scenario that would be in the form of the way that you would do a normal hour-long pair programming, but for the person to record it instead of being like watched, like, you know, during that particular time. I think recording it with AI available for that whatever duration you want, I think that's going to be as close to what it's going to be in the real workforce than anything else that interviews could provide. So I think that's going to be, you know, what's going to happen. But yeah, that's what I think AI is going to be doing in terms of development. This is a really interesting question. You're asked to build a website, but you're only allowed to use 4 CSS properties. What are those? Okay. The interesting thing about this is that I'm thinking about how, like, a Craigslist, for example, right? If you think about Craigslist, Craigslist is very unstyled, right? So I probably would direct myself to doing some sort of like Craigslist-looking thing. I think the first property that I would consider would be overflow wrap break word. And I have a post about that. It's called Anti-Data Loss Configurationism. It's like the latest post I have on my blog. And it's effectively a reset of CSS. Then the only thing that that's really doing is breaking long URLs, right? So if you put our URL inside of text, it's making it so that it doesn't, like, you know, get too long. It allows it to wrap. And I think that's really helpful. So I put that in there. I actually wouldn't even put box sizing border box, because if I'm not allowed to use the other properties, or there's not a lot of properties to be using, then there's no reason for me to be playing with box sizing at all. So I wouldn't even use that. I think this is a really great question. What else would I use? I think I would use a style for max width 100%, specifically for like images and stuff. I think that would be really helpful, just to clean up some of the image work that would be going on in there. Because when those overflow and break out, I really don't like that. What else would I use? I'd really have to think about this. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you know what? I think I'm going to maybe make a post about it later. Great question. Moving right along here. Again, a whole bunch of this stuff is kind of more specific. These look like some replies to these things. This looks like a more technical question about installation. I don't really think that's cool. I shouldn't say it's cool. I should say I don't think it's appropriate for this right now. Do you still have a passion for web development? Absolutely. Well, with a caveat. And the caveat is that I think web development has gotten over complex. I still remember the times where I used to just write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in individual text files. No syntax highlighting, just raw dogging that whole thing and producing stuff. Do not get me wrong. I don't want to go back to those times, okay? But on the flip side, I think we've also gone too far in the wrong directions, okay? That's a lot of the reason why I really like Astro, is that Astro really kind of like holds on to some of the stuff from back then, where you're able to like write was effectively HTML, but it's more powerful because it's templated. You can go ahead and rewrite that stuff, right? Scoping with CSS to be like, you know, componentized. I think that's really helpful these days. I think the JavaScript-y stuff that's in Astro is a little bit cumbersome, specifically when it comes to client-side JavaScript. I think it'll end up being a little bit cumbersome. I wish that was a little bit easier to work with, because you kind of have to, like, you know, select by ID, just like we've been doing. And, you know, I think there's something that could be more modern than that. But overall, I would prefer that kind of web development direction as opposed to what effectively I'm doing for Delta Zeus, right? Because in Delta Zeus, it's literally just one single index file. And then the rest of me banging my head is a whole bunch of computer science stuff, which I don't really enjoy. I don't really enjoy computer science related stuff much. I learned it because that's what the web needed back, years ago. And we kind of, again, went a little too far, in my opinion. But that's all right. Let's see here. If someone becomes pretty advanced in CSS and HTML, how close have they gotten to being job ready? You are not job ready. Unless you're going to be doing freelance stuff, right? The reality of it is that the full-time roles that are out there for these tech companies are expecting what is effectively a full-stack engineer. And unfortunately, when they even call for front-end engineers, they really just mean JavaScript engineer. That's what everyone's really hiring for. They're really hiring for JavaScript engineers. No one's hiring for an HTML or CSS engineer. And it really is kind of like unfortunate because there's some specialty in there. And it's actually the reason why I wanted to try to start a program or even a SaaS called CSS Reviews that was going to help identify and highlight experts in CSS and potentially other things over time. But the reality of it is especially with AI kind of like sweeping the floor with solutions of things, it's probably going to be a lot less and less focused on. So the reality, again, is focusing on JavaScript. That's what people are hiring for. And hopefully in between all this, you do get your skills up in HTML and CSS during all that time. I think that's really still important. But again, it's not what people are asking for. That's the unfortunate reality of it all. Let's see here. Okay, interesting. So if given a use case allows for the use of grid and flex, which do you prefer? I think the question is more like, which one would you choose, flex or grid? For me, it's almost always flex. It's almost always flex. And I think much of the reason for that for me is that for grid, I specifically use grid basically for card layout. That's basically it. I use the kind of, what is it called, like the magic incantation of grid template columns, repeat, auto fit, min-max, 260 pixels, 1FR. It's basically what I do. That's like every single time. And in fact, I should probably change the 260 to like some kind of REM-based value, but that's usually what I've been using for years, for using for grid. It's very rare that I use grid for almost anything else. If I need to do some reorganization of elements, I might consider it, but that also depends on the accessibility part of it, because when you start reordering stuff, the document flow changes, and it might not be expected for a user. So flex ends up being a lot easier to just manage, especially from a component standpoint, right? I don't need to necessarily define anything there. It just kind of fills space and that kind of stuff. So the majority of my work ends up being flex. That's usually what just ends up what it being. Another AI questions, I kind of answered that already. Ooh, who are your favorite go-to industry leaders that you follow? So right now, I'm paying attention to TJ Petre, who's doing a lot of AI, MCP related stuff in the design system space. When I say I'm paying attention to, I'm seeing that he's doing work, but I'm not able to follow what he's doing. I haven't really sat down and like looked at all of it and paid attention to that like in deeply, such that I could like make formulated opinions about it. I'll definitely follow Mike Mai. He's really big in the HTML, CSS, and accessibility space. He's helped me out in a couple different areas when it comes to those facets, especially in like accessibility and like landmark regions and things like that. Really helpful. So I'm following Mike Mai when he's doing. Kevin Powell with CSS and the way he's teaching things, I think is really cool. He's finding some really cool stuff. We jam on some stuff every once in a while, very rarely on different things that could be happening. But yeah, I think those are good resources there. I'm trying to think of who else that comes to mind. I'll say Matthew Strom. He's the person who helped out with the color contrast function. He posts something every once in a while. He usually, he's the opposite of me, because when I usually make articles, I just like kind of blurt them out immediately. You know, maybe they're a little bit rough or unpolished, but I want the information out. And I think that's more important to start a conversation than on, I think, Matthew's side. He likes to really dive into something and polish that particular article. So his stuff is obviously high quality all the time, but it just takes a while for that stuff to come out. Speaking of high quality articles, Josh Como, I think, is also a really good person to be following. I have shared his What the Heck Z-Index post lots of times. So if you haven't seen that post, it is a great post to be looking at. And it's usually the ammunition that I use to kind of tell people to stop using Z-Index for stuff and just stop using, you know, layering, and let DOM ordering handle the positioning, especially with the top layer coming out for the browsers. That's, I think everybody that I can think of. Yeah, I think that's pretty much all the people that are on top of my head. Let's see here. Okay, this is like favorite book, game, movie, which the only thing I have is Overcooked. Although, actually, speaking of which, I have a previous life as a professional gamer. I'm actually staring at a trophy right now from the last competition that I won, which was for Guilty Gear Accent Core Plus R. That trophy is about 10 or 11 years old at this point. I'm very proud of it, though. It was first place. And I've had people tell me back then I was one of the best Zappas in the country with that game, which I was really proud of. And then also in a similar time for that, I was a professional DDR player. I did competitions all over the United States. I was internationally known. There was like a magazine in German that did a story on me that I still have somewhere. So that was a big deal for me for a long time too. I still play DDR actually. I'm probably going to try to play tonight because I am fat, so the exercise is really good. Okay, let's see. Oh, have you ever contributed to a W3 Spec or something of that nature? The answer is I've tried to. So there's a couple of things that I've found in the social medias that I'm paying attention to. One of the first ones was oddly specific. It happened to be talking about something about Mongolian. I don't remember in particular. It was something about the way that I think the sentences were structured, and I think it had to do something about with hyphens or other diacritics or something like that was in there. Something that people don't know about me is that I studied Mongolian for like a year and a half. I actually still have all the reference materials. That's also across from where I am right now. I have a very significant Mongolian dictionary. It's called the Lessing. And it's like hundreds of pages, has different types of translations back and forth. Yeah, I have about 10 books on Mongolian. So I was like uniquely qualified to kind of be a part of that conversation. But there was actual native Mongolian people that were in there that ended up in there that were able to provide some insight also. But more recently, I do have an open issue in the CSS working group about cursor size. And actually, I'm going to put my phone down for a second to talk to you about cursor size just for a moment, maybe there'll be a longer video about it, but the important thing about that particular issue is that we see people using custom cursors all the time. You know, even Figma uses custom cursors. And the unfortunate reality there is that when a person uses the custom size on their device, so on their OS, that's not brought up to these custom cursors. So like very commonly, my cursor on my computers, and actually you can see it here, I'll bring it on to the back over here. Probably seen it in other videos. But that cursor is huge, right? That cursor is really big. But if I bring that cursor into an application like Photoshop and I choose one of those custom tools there, that cursor becomes wildly small for me. It's really hard to find. So granted, like, you know, Adobe Photoshop generally is just, you know, an application that lives on your desktop, and there's something different about that, obviously. But even in websites that are highly stylized that change the cursor, I think it would be really helpful to have a cursor change to reflect the device size. But maybe that's a longer video for another time. I've also contributed to another discussion. I contributed to the masonry discussion, so that masonry discussion that's going on, because I do have some experience talking about grids and things like that. But the other one I contributed to was the nested border radius discussion. There was an idea that popped up that was like, hey, can we have keywords that automatically do nested border radius? And the unfortunate reality is, no, you can't. And I'm going to kind of give myself credit for completely kiboshing that thread, because I have a blog post on it. I have a blog post called Meaningless Curves Ahead, and it talks about how I tried to make border radius semantic, which inherently it cannot be done. And in order for you to understand why it can't be done, you have to understand my definition of semantic. But ultimately, it wouldn't be possible in all the ways that you would want to have nested border radius happen. Nested border radius is very much tied to layout, and you would effectively trying to be doing like semantic layout, and we're not there yet from an understanding design point of view. But anyway, those are the things that I can remember that I contributed to. Let's see what else we have here. Do you think it's necessary to learn data structures and algorithms for front-end development? Yes-ish. I mean, I guess now, especially for making you know, jobs and stuff like that, trying to get roles, that's what they're looking for, the leak code stuff. When I started doing it, the answer was you kind of fall into it. You kind of have to get into an array in order to like loop through to add click handlers and things like that. So like I fell into learning data structures. It certainly means that there's definitely got to be ways of doing things that is better than the way that I'm doing things, right? More performant, big O notation, all that BS. But I'm not good at that, I'll tell you right now. I will let you know, though, that I can write my own regex without asking anybody, generally speaking. I can manipulate a data object in JavaScript without having to worry too much overall. So I have my own strengths that many other people don't. So I have those. Whether or not, you know, people are writing regexes on a regular basis, probably not so much. To SCSS or not to SCSS? Interesting. Yeah. So what I will say is that I started to really like the idea of nesting CSS, especially when it came to making components. Because at that point, it ended up being in a scenario where, like, I didn't have to name everything. Naming is hard, right? And that's a lot of the reason why people don't like CSS, because they have to name something and all of a sudden they name it like container wrapper, being very useless as a name, but just use like a selection process. And in fact, I identified this and made a project called HTML by CSS, which allows you to write CSS and generate HTML from that CSS, which was a fun project that I did in like a couple of weeks. I don't think I've ever used it. I don't know if anyone's actually used it in an application. I'm not sure how good it is to actually use. But the reason for that was that I'm typically writing lots of CSS and very little HTML. So the ability to just write that HTML off of the CSS by nesting was really cool. But now nesting is native in the browser. Browsers can accept nesting pretty easily. So what is SCSS doing now for you? Maybe it's doing some mix-ins for you, but maybe that's just a class name. Maybe it's doing other stuff. I don't know. Like I haven't done a lot with SCSS directly. I've made a couple of mix-ins over time, but generally speaking, I'd much rather leverage things like class names and CSS variables over mix-ins, I think. Oh, okay, I'm thinking of my own system now. There are definitely mix-ins in my own system, and that's because, like, a really good example of that is I have a button mix-in, and I use that button mix-in to then apply button styles to the input type file, and because it's a button that's in there. So I take those styles and I put them under another selector. That's what's going on there. So it ends up being a little bit easier to move those collections around sometimes. So I think that's probably the most helpful part of the whole thing. I imagine there would be a different way of doing that by just putting things underneath those selectors, but then the organization of those components and the file structures might be weird. So I think there's something to the CSS importing stuff, or the SCSS. And actually, speaking of which, SCSS is necessary for my implementation of interoperable tokens, where you're able to write a token in SCSS and in JavaScript in the exact same way. So in that way, I think there's some benefit to it as well. But for normal day-to-day writing CSS, normal vanilla CSS is actually usually just fine. Ooh, this is an interesting question. I like this. What's your thought processes going through when you're debugging CSS? Are you adding random properties until something works? Okay, put my phone down for this one. Okay, what is my process when I'm debugging CSS? Well, the first thing I obviously do is I open up the DevTools panel, right? I want to go ahead and start clicking around on things. Of course, it depends on what I'm debugging, right? So like a really possible thing is that maybe, I don't know, the element isn't the size that I'm expecting it to be. Or maybe the alignment is off, something like that. So what I end up doing with that most of the time is I start highlighting elements. And when I highlight the element, I'm also looking at the box model, which is in like the computed tab. And I'm looking to see what padding is being applied, what margins are being applied, all that kind of stuff. I'm looking down there. If I don't find anything that's out of the ordinary there, then I start going into the styles panel and I start overriding stuff. So not necessarily going into existing rules, but I usually just use the style tag that's up on top just to apply it directly to the element, just because that's going to be the most specific. And then a lot of the time what I'll do is I'll usually add a display flex on something, because in my experience, display flex typically ends up normalizing things very often because it uses a totally different algorithm for laying things out. So that usually helps out a little bit in terms of identifying what's going on. Sometimes I would say back in the day I used to use the outline trick, right, to outline where is this thing in the page. Not so much anymore, and that's mostly because DevTools is usually really good at trying to find elements in there, and identifying by highlighting where they are. So I usually haven't outlined a lot of stuff in most recent years. If something is the wrong color, that's going in the computer panel and finding out where that color is and what's overriding it, right? That's usually what my process is, generally speaking. But yeah, it is really just a lot of diving deep into elements, seeing how they are composed in the page and in its larger composition, seeing what those properties are. Because again, most of the time debugging is all about layout, arrangement, and size. So we're looking at properties that are going to affect that kind of stuff. When it comes to color and font, that's usually pretty easy because you could just go into the computed panel, and it's usually just inherited from some other thing higher up. That's usually what the process is for me. Let's see here. Oh, here we go. Do you think the Design Tokens community group and tools like Style Dictionary will become more standard during development now that new features like variables, light and dark, conditionals, etc. Are going to be making a design system easier? Yes. Interesting. Actually, my answer is not necessarily yes. I am highly critical of the Design Tokens community group. I am a member of the community group, however, I am wildly inactive. I just see the notifications in GitHub and I just glaze over personally. From as I understand it right now, it really looks like the folks from Token Studio have kind of taken over the community group. And that's a little bit worrying to me, because then that's going to effectively shape what they think tokens should be in their eyes. And sure, do I have a different perspective when it comes to tokens? Absolutely. Like, it's very clear for most people that know about me. They know that I have a very strict definition of tokens and the way that they're supposed to be done. And I'm open to compromise when it comes to the larger organization, because I do live a reality. But there's also lots of things in there that I believe are just the wrong direction overall. A really good example of the wrong direction overall was the color spec. So the color specification and the color type in there, I think, is wildly overcomplicated. And it is probably the straw that broke my camel's back. That was like, I don't want to be here anymore. If you want to know more about that, I think I've talked about it before in maybe a couple of blog posts, but overall, if you look at the color spec, you'll see that it has different kind of composition than other values that are in the specification. And if that's going to set a precedent about other values that are in the specification, this specification will never be done. Which is a lot of the reason why other places, like Salesforce as an example, decided to forego the idea of design tokens such that they could do something more simple. They call it style hooks over there in Salesforce Lightning Design System version 2. They call it style hooks, but it's exactly the same thing as what we would normally call design tokens. It's just not to the community group spec. So it's going to be potentially the same thing as React and Tailwind. They're going to make people, understand easier what's going on with design tokens, probably. Would there have been a better direction to take? Most likely. But here's the direction that people are aligning to, and so be it. I'm still looking through some of these because they get more specific and less general, because other general ones have been asked earlier in this list. All right. I think, oh wait, there's one here. What are the pros and cons of using REMs for most sizes for front-end projects? How often is it used in production? All right. I have a blog post about this too. It is called, font size dimensions, I think. It's pretty recent. Where I try to figure out, when we're talking about things like size and dimension, what unit should we actually be using at any point in time, right? You could use, pixels for some things. You could use M's and REMs for other things. You could use percentages in places. What are you supposed to be using? The TLDR for when you are going to be using pixels or an absolute value versus a relative value like a REM or an M has to do with context, really. So if we think specifically about, okay, I'm going to choose REMs as an example. Where would I use REMs? Well, some people, including myself, would use REMs in things like padding and gap, okay? And this was a very common standard for a really long time because people would say, oh, you know, everything's supposed to be relative. It's better than the fixed pixel value, you know, et cetera. It allows it to grow and shrink and things like that. I've since walked that back because I realized that people zoom on their browsers, right, to increase the font size, increase elements, and things like that. And even like there's a difference between the zoom in your browser and the font size setting in your device OS. But in either case, what was kind of important to me is that if the font size is increasing, I don't also, in most cases, want the padding and the gap to increase, right? Because that's just going to make the entire page larger. When in reality, all this person is trying to do is be able to read these things, right? That's all they really want to be able to do. And if the text is too small, they're going to want it to be increased. So the relative distances amongst all of those things, they don't need to change, right? Because the size between the edges of the button will be smaller than the size of the edges between, you know, the billboard of the header, right? You can have those maintained in pixel values, no problem. So when it comes to padding and gap, I think it makes a lot more sense to actually use pixels over anything like a rem or an M. Now, when it comes to dimensions, like I kind of alluded to earlier, I think dimensions makes a lot more sense when it comes to use M's and REMs than pixels. And the reason for that in particular is because things that, like, if you're going to make a constraint, like for a card, I think that constraint is really based on the content within, right? So if the content is increasing at a normal size, like again, a font size is increasing, then the restriction on how big this thing should be is related to that font size most likely. So I think that the card restriction, what I used to use is 260 pixels, I think would be much better to be something more like 10 or 12 rem as an example, right? I probably wouldn't use M because that could change based on, you know, where it's being set. I think root size M's is probably makes a lot more sense, or any of the other root font size related units that makes more sense. But when we're talking about things like width and height and putting constraints on those, container queries, media queries, I think it makes a lot more sense to be using rem because the font size is going to increase and decrease. So that's what my rule of thumb is. You'll see in all my sites though right now is that many of them still use rem inside of them. So something to pay attention to in that case. All right, moving right along here. Let's see if there's any other questions that are interesting while I notice that my other camera is out. Ridiculous. Oh, no, it's back. Okay. Okay, that's basically the end of this, I think. Yeah, I think this is basically the end of this AMA. I'm hoping that there's a future where I have a community of people behind me that are interested in things that I like and talk about that I could communicate with. I think that would be really cool at some point. But as it stands right now, this was kind of fun overall. Because I have opinions on this stuff, obviously. I mean, it's pretty clear that I have opinions on these things. But thank you for joining me for today. I know it's another long one, but hopefully there's a couple of good clips that came out of this. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.
Thank you.